Welcome to Therapist Starter Pack, a podcast for those who are getting started in the field of mental health therapy. I'm Autumn, and I'll be your host today. Today we'll be talking about imposter syndrome and what students experiencing it, as well as educators and supervisors witnessing it, can do about it. So the first natural question is, what is imposter syndrome? Gottlieb defined imposter syndrome as an inability to internalize success and the tendency to attribute success to external causes like luck, error, or personal connections. So imposter syndrome is this idea of feeling like you don't belong or don't deserve to be in a certain space because you aren't able to recognize your own achievements, essentially. Gottlieb said that imposter syndrome is linked to increased work-related stress, depression, anxiety, and burnout, and that up to 60% of medical students and up to 44% of residents suffer from imposter syndrome during their training. This is an incredibly common thing to experience and go through. The thought is, according to Gottlieb et al. In 2019, is that without the proper amount of guidance and support, self-doubt and low self-esteem can develop and lead to imposter syndrome over the course of training in the career. Gottlieb also says that in addition to learning new knowledge and skills, we also start to develop a professional identity during the course of our training. They talk about how at some point a physician needs to go from simply acting like a physician to becoming one. This is not a linear or simple process, and there's going to be a lot of moments where there are obstacles to overcome that may lead to feeling like an imposter in the process. And then there is the topic of imposter syndrome amongst marginalized communities. Sills, Krosos, and Mentis said that imposter syndrome has been found to be more prevalent in high achievers, women, and underrepresented racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. And this leads us to ask a very important question. Is imposter syndrome really about an individual's personal failure to recognize their achievements, or does it also come from the environment that has led to this internalized perception of themselves as being less than worthy? While we are responsible for the ways that we interact with the world and the ways we think about ourselves, ultimately those internalized thoughts had to come from somewhere, and we need to be able to look at the environment around us to be able to also see that this is a systemic problem. Tolshan and Burry said, "In truth, we don't belong because we were never supposed to belong." Biased practices across institutions routinely stymie the ability of individuals from underrepresented groups to truly thrive. The answer to overcoming imposter syndrome is not to fix individuals, but to create an environment that fosters a variety of leadership styles and in which diverse racial, ethnic, and gender identities are seen as just as professional as the current model. As Mullangi and Jagsi said, imposter syndrome is but a symptom. Inequity is the disease. So that's all well and good. We've determined that imposter syndrome is a systemic issue, but what can students individually do to help themselves through it? Weir described some things that we can do to help ourselves through imposter syndrome. Number one is to talk to your mentors. People who have been there before, who have been through this, who can really help you and talk through what you're feeling and be able to help you recognize your strengths as well as your places for growth on an objective level that is not all inside your head and inside all of those internalized feelings that we have. The second is actually really interesting because it goes in the opposite direction. They recommend working with other people who are earlier in the program than you, so you can realize how far you've come and what you bring to the table. This isn't a matter of comparing yourself against others. It's about seeing the ways in which you bring value to the people around you. And by being able to give to others, we're able to give ourselves a better understanding of our abilities and our unique qualities that give us strength. They also recommend writing down the things you're good at and the areas that might need work. They recommend writing both because if you write down your strengths, that allows you to see the abilities that you're really working with and the capabilities that you have and bring to the table. while also being able to be honest with yourself and be able to say, okay, these are the things I need to grow on. These are the things that I can improve on. And by making sure that we understand where we can grow, that puts us in a different mindset. A growth mindset is where we are able to see that we are imperfect, but we are constantly working towards becoming better at our jobs and as people. It sees growth as an ongoing process rather than a destination that you have to get to. And the reason we have to do that is because nobody is perfect. We have to be able to find a line where we can draw for ourselves and say, we did that task well enough. We need to recognize our own successes and develop and implement awards for success. We need to celebrate our successes and be able to find ways to be able to recognize for ourselves how far we have come. Weir continues by recommending that you change your way of thinking by reframing the way you think about your achievements. And this is going to take time because we've built up this idea of who we need to be over the course of a lifetime. And it's going to take time to chip away at that. But we can work through it. Just be kind to yourself and give yourself plenty of time to be able to work through this. Finally, Weir recommends talking to someone who can help. Professionals have the tools to help you with what you need to talk about. That's why you're in school right now, to be able to become a person who can do this kind of stuff for people, right? It's okay to ask for help. Therapists have therapists. That's okay. Okay, so we've talked about how students can approach imposter syndrome. How about the supervisors and educators in charge of creating that environment we were talking about in order to not create more of this imposter syndrome internalization? If we go back to Gottlieb, they had a lot of interesting things to say to supervisors and educators, one of which is to consider the impact of imposter syndrome on feedback and address it as part of the educational experience. Another suggestion is to have open discussions with learners about imposter syndrome within education. We also want to normalize identifying knowledge gaps and encourage learners to focus on their growth as opposed to just achieving certain goals. We want to provide feedback that's balanced with sufficient positive and specific praise to encourage continued growth in addition to emphasizing areas for improvement. And then there's this piece which I think is incredibly important. We need to address our own limitations as educators. Learners better avoid the drive towards perfectionism and better accept that feedback is critical for growth when we're able to show our own vulnerability and be able to show that we are people ourselves and that we make mistakes as well. If we cannot show an example of how we are not perfect, but that's still okay, how are we supposed to expect these students to learn that? We have to be able to show some level of vulnerability in order to be able to have our students be able to show us the same. If we look at the work of Sills, Krosos, and Mentis, we also see that professors, principal investigators, and peers should encourage students and fellow scientists to focus on factual evidence regarding their academic performance and to set realistic expectations. They should have open discussions about imposter syndrome at the institutional level and put a name to these feelings and normalize them as common experiences rather than pathologizing them. They recommend group peer mentoring because we're, again, able to include people of multiple different stages and be able to help them all transition into mentors and build self-confidence as they each become individual practitioners and students and professionals. They also recommend outreach programs to people as young as high school to make sure students are aware of imposter syndrome, to help them identify and overcome it as they pursue their own education and careers. Okay, so let's wrap this all up. Imposter syndrome is ultimately a form of internalized hypercriticism and often internalized oppression. Internal means it came from somewhere. That means that, at least in my opinion, imposter syndrome is a systemic problem of standards of perfectionism and institutional bias against marginalized communities, not just some weakness of an individual to recognize their accomplishments. And as with many social problems, the solution is social. Those experiencing imposter syndrome can reach out to others ahead and behind them in their careers to put themselves in the proper context and create mutual support. They can also work on their own internal dialogue using the same tools you'd learn to work with any internalized falsehoods or automatic thoughts. Put those therapist skills to work, folks, but do it with self-compassion. But as we said before, systemic problems demand systemic solutions. Educators and supervisors need to be open about imposter syndrome and be the one to bring it up, preferably by disclosing examples about your own limits if you're comfortable. This vulnerability helps students feel more willing to share their own vulnerability. Educators and supervisors should also work to cultivate a growth mindset environment. Gottlieb said, any period of successful growth inevitably involves navigation of the gap between what the learner can do and what the learner cannot do. Isn't that what learning is? Being able to go from not being able to do something to being able to do something? That's going to take time, and it's going to take work, and it's going to mean going through a lot of in-between stages. And during that time, we need to balance negative feedback with a strengths-based approach. Help them get to where they need to go using what they are already proficient in and capable of. But to go back to the students, because you're secretly my favorite, I want to tell you a little bit of a story by Neil Gaiman. He said he was talking to a very nice, polite, elderly gentleman about a few things, including how they had the same first name. And he pointed towards the Hall of People, and this gentleman said, I just look at all these people and I think, what the heck am I doing here? They've made amazing things. I just went where I was sent. And Neil Gaiman said, yes, but you were the first man on the moon. I think that counts for something. And he felt better, because if Neil Armstrong felt like an imposter, maybe everyone did. As he says, maybe there weren't any grown-ups, only people who had worked hard and also got lucky and were slightly out of their depth. All of us doing the best job we could, which is all we can really hope for. And that's all for today. All sources will be in the show notes and at our website, therapiststarterpack.net. You can also find links there to subscribe to this show and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, which would be a huge help to this show. And until next time, remember, everyone starts somewhere.